Marveling at Monsters, a presentation on vampires by Haley Figueroa, Bianca Delgaro, and Samantha Reeder. What are vampires? Vampires are considered icons in the world of horror. Everyone has heard of them and has most likely seen them in movies, TV shows, or novels. They are humanoid creatures that feed on the blood of animals and or humans. They are often described as pale figures because they are undead. They also have fangs and some can go as far as to turn into a bat. The typical vampire usually lurks around at night because the sun can affect their vitality or can turn them into dust. Garlic and wooden stakes can also be methods to ward them off or send them back to the grave. Notable vampires. There are quite a few vampires we think of when someone brings up the term. The first of many is the infamous Count Dracula, the title character of the Gothic novel, written by Bram Stoker in 1897. Count Orlok from the famous silent film Nosferatu is another prominent vampire figure, the film adaptation of Stoker's novel. However, in more recent films and novels, vampires aren't always featured as the villains. Take Edward Cullen from the Twilight Saga, for example. He displays the iconic vampire characteristics, but he is the lead figure in a romance movie. And unlike other vampires mentioned before, he is considered an attractive vampire. And of course, there's a combination of the attractive and the villainous vampires in the media as well. For example, Lady Gaga's iconic character in American Horror Story's 5th season, Hotel. The Countess is notable as a more recent adaptation of vampires for being portrayed as dangerous and sexy, like many other modern vampires are. She is also considered to be a strong female character, which adds to her notability. Origins of the vampire. Vampires were myths that originated from the Middle Ages and stemmed from towns that were infected by the plague. Because one of the symptoms of the disease was bleeding from mouth lesions, people believed it was caused by vampirism, since they weren't as educated as we are today. Another disease that has been said to be linked to the myth was a blood disorder by the name of porphyria. A common symptom of this disease was blistering when being in the sunlight, which is where vampires' hatred of the sun comes from. It is also said that symptoms can be relieved by ingesting blood. Other diseases that may have inspired the myth were rabies, tuberculosis, and goiter. How people dealt with vampires. Many people believed that the suspected vampires would often come back from the dead and spread their vampirism. So they'd often take burials very seriously. The dead were dug up to search for signs of vampirism, and oftentimes a wooden stake would be stabbed through the corpses' hearts to make sure they'd stay dead. However, others didn't stop at a stake through the heart. People went so far as to burn the corpses of the suspected vampires and even decapitate them. This has been reported to be methods of disposing the dead bodies that would continue to be used well into the 19th century. Vampires throughout history. While many people think Dracula is the most famous vampire, there is actually someone who rivals him. Mercy Brown, a young woman from Exeter, Rhode Island, was one of the first real vampires. She was the daughter of a farmer named George Brown. She was one of many of his family members that were lost to tuberculosis, or commonly known at the time, consumption. After having her grave dug open and corpse checked, Mercy was discovered not to show any signs of decay, and thus the townsfolk proclaimed her as a vampire and blamed her for causing her family's sickness from beyond the grave. Her heart was cut out and burned, and the ashes were fed to her sick brother as some sort of medicine or miracle cure. However, he passed away shortly after consuming the ashes. Vampires in the past. In the past, the myth of the sick being vampires was similar to the myth of women being witches. Some of the methods used to contain the spread of vampirism are like those used in the Salem witch trials. The only difference is that unlike those considered witches, those considered to be vampires were already dead. The fear of vampires also came from being uneducated on diseases as well as science. Vampire novels from the past could be seen as continuation of these myths being spread through the time. However, much more fictitious things were being added to them, like the ability to turn into a bat. What do vampires represent? As mentioned previously, vampires represented the fear of disease and scientific miseducation. Even turning into a bat could be linked to disease, since rabies was also one of the sicknesses that inspired vampire tales. Vampires were used as scapegoats for diseases for hundreds of years. In regards to not understanding science, the beliefs of vampires also have to do with not understanding how a body decomposes. When looking at the original vampires from the movies, one would see that Count Orlok in Nosferatu looks similar to how a decomposing corpse is said to look. He has long fingernails and teeth, and skin that looks somewhat shrunk. Longer-looking fingernails and teeth with shrunken skin is a common look for a corpse. However, in the past, the people didn't know that. In that sense, vampires may have also represented a fear of death. Vampires today. Modern vampires are much different than they were in the past. That includes the messages that came from the existence of them. Since we understand science, we are much more capable of understanding that vampires aren't real. At least, a majority of vampires aren't real. There are a few people that consider themselves to be real vampires because they believe that drinking blood will allow them to remain healthy. However, they only drink small amounts and get their supply from willing donors. This is overlooked by a majority of society because they don't want to rekindle the superstitions that science has silenced. Thus, they remain on a low radar. Vampires in the media. At the beginning of the presentation, many famous fictional vampires were introduced, and there's quite an obvious change in vampire portrayal. When compared to Dracula and Count Orlok, Edward Cullen and the Countess are much more attractive, and even though that is a very small observation, one can see that vampires have changed in the media too. Like mentioned before, vampires in the media were also influenced by not understanding science. Today, society understands that a vampire who comes back from the dead doesn't exist. Thus, they've become something different. For starters, when watching a vampire movie, you may have noticed that vampires have much more supernatural abilities. Edward, for example, can move extremely fast. In the past, vampires could not do this. It seems that some interpretations and portrayals of vampires are much more human-like. They have more self-control, and some have psychologically similar factors to humans. Like mentioned before, they're even more attractive than the old vampires. How vampires' message changed. Vampires and the messages they gave have seen many changes throughout the course of time. Originally, stories of vampires were stemmed from the fear of sickness and not having the knowledge of diseases and their symptoms that we do today. However, the vampire has evolved into something people know isn't real. When more people learned that vampires were merely a work of fiction, they were able to see them more as a fun type of scary, which is why they're so popular in the horror world. The modern adaptation of the vampire is very interesting because they're mostly portrayals like Edward Cullen and the Countess. They're much more sexy, and they represent something more sensual and dangerous, rather than being scary and dangerous. This could be based on the intensity and excitement of the idea and desire for something that is considered forbidden. Questions for the class. Vampires can have many meanings that depend on how a viewer interprets them. When you think of vampires, what comes to your mind? What do vampires say about society in the past and in current times? How has the message of vampires changed with society?
Vampires and their communities. Vampires are either feared or they're hunted, but oftentimes members of a certain community are totally unaware that there are even vampires among them. they try their best to keep their vampirism a secret. They try to assimilate to the community by attending high school or having regular jobs, and they'll do this in hopes of living in secret so that they'll be able to feed on their prey easier. And if they ever feel like people are onto them, they'll move away, so they're very nomadic. In some cases, villagers are aware of vampirism and they'll begin to fight back. Humans viewed vampirism like a medieval plague, and once they suspect that someone's a vampire, they'll have them killed or they'll have them captured and weakened, and then they perform tests on them. In most folklore stories, there's no cure for vampirism. Any town that a vampire lives in, there will be multiple deaths of innocent people, and this inherently institutes fear among the humans. Vampires are very intense monsters, and they do have core values that are similar to most humans. The first one being loyalty and family. They don't trust that many people, but when they do, they'll keep them close, and they sort of treat everybody else like enemies. They do portray a lot of courage because they put themselves in dangerous situations where they'll have to be brave. Prosperity. They live luxurious lives, often living in castles or mansions, and they're art collectors or something like that. How they accumulate their wealth is often not ethical. Leadership, they have like a declared leader, and if you go against this leader, you're killed. Vampires have an immense amount of power and abilities, and they do nothing to use those abilities for good or to help humankind. Vampires promote ideas of revenge, fear, violence, beauty, hypersexuality, and addiction. They're very vindictive creatures. If you do them wrong, they'll kill you or do you wrong. In modern day vampires, like the ones in the Vampire Diaries, it glorifies death and violence and murder by making it look like seductive. And the vampires that are presented in this show, Vampire Diaries, help make sense of human strivings and failings, because Stefan, the brother on the left in the first picture, he's kind of like the poster child for a perfect human. Even though he's a vampire, he's loyal, he's honest, he's a good leader, and he doesn't kill humans, he feeds on animals. And then Damon on the right, he's a murderer, a liar, manipulator, all of those things. And then in these videos, it shows how vampires help make sense of the human strivings and failings, because it shows that vampires have heightened emotions, so their sense of strength, smell, hearing, sadness, anger, happiness are all heightened. So in this first video, we see that in the character Vicky.
No. I said no. No! Ow! That hurt.
Hey, leave her alone.
Go, Tyler. Get the hell away from me.
Nick, it's Matt. Hey, what's wrong?
No! 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 No!
What the?
Finally, you're awake. Come on, move.
See, you're already starting to fall apart.
And I'm going home now.
Okay, fine. What happened after I left last night, Vic? Jared, you okay?
No.
No, Vicky!
I'm sorry.
What's wrong?
Or what? Let's get one thing straight, you turkey little bitch. You had my brother whipped for 15 years. 15 years, and then you dumped him. When I look at you, that is all I see. Got it?
Let it go?
My head hurts. I'm sorry, Maddie, but I want to stay.
As you can see, that character Vicky, she shows a lot of negative traits, and she's violent and angry. And in the second video, the good vampire Stefan explains to the character Elena what she's going to be feeling now that she's turned into a vampire.
Disgusting.
No,
It's disgusting.
yeah, I'm gonna puke. Oh. I never thought I'd be saying this, but I can't stop thinking about blood.
I should have saved you first. You shouldn't be going through this right now.
No, if you'd saved me, then Matt would be dead. What do you think I'd be going through then? Stefan, listen to me. You did the right thing. You did what you always do. You respected my choice.
And what am I supposed to do if Bonnie can't figure out a way to help you, huh? Because then you have another choice to make. Either let yourself die or be a vampire.
Well, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Oh my God, did I just say cross that bridge?
You're laughing. I'm pretty sure you don't actually think that's funny.
I can't stop them.
Your emotions are a bit heightened today. A lot heightened. It's okay. It's okay.
I'm sorry.
Listen to me. No matter what happens, I'm here for you. I can help you. Why don't you go back upstairs where it's dark? I'll clean up.
Some myths have had benefit. The existence of vampires is a myth. Some myths have had beneficial effects on society. However, the vampire has had a very harmful influence on society since its birth in 1897. Vampirism roots in the spread of various diseases and plagues during that time period. It seemed very plausible for those who had died of diseases to come back from the dead. Many people were so quick to believe this because of the lack of research that had been done on common illnesses like tuberculosis and rabies. There was an overwhelming amount of uneducated people, even among those who had spent years in school. This misunderstanding encouraged people to turn to vampirism, which was an easy explanation for the spread of diseases. It was harmful because it convinced people to mistrust one another and their dead loved ones. People were paranoid, like they were during the Salem witch trials, that supernatural forces, the vampires, were causing problems. The myth of vampires was also able to target the more specific fear that people had of death and dying. People were paranoid that their relatives might become vampires because of their own fear of death. Since there was no proof of life after death back then, people had to have faith that they would end up in heaven. This set up an easy avenue for people to have their suspicions. They were faced with questions around the existence of heaven and hell. Their doubt could conclude that their relative could come back to life because there is no heaven or hell. This uncertainty struck a lot of terror in people. This created an unhealthy relationship for society to have with death. Therefore, vampirism harmed society mentally and emotionally by encouraging doubt and distress amongst the people. Not only have vampires harmed society in the past, but they continue to harm our society now. There are many examples of vampires in the entertainment industry because people are fascinated with monsters. Modern vampires are similar in many ways, but the biggest difference is their role in society. Vampires are viewed now as dangerous still, but almost heroic because of their supernatural abilities. In many film productions like Twilight and The Vampire Diaries, vampires are also portrayed overly sexualized. This causes a lot of problems because of their Eurocentric features that may encourage negative feelings towards non-Eurocentric features. This is also a problem because it encourages behaviors like control and jealousy that are common from the vampire in relationships. These examples are problematic for society, especially since no one is talking about it. Overall, vampires have not been beneficial to society and will continue to have a negative influence on people everywhere. Here are a couple of the examples of older versions of vampires and how they looked versus vampires now and how they look.